I'm ready for a little more Henry Huggins. Remember, we were reading about finding the worms. His neighbor was out looking in the yard for worms. Here is one, Mr. Grumby swooped and held up a worm in the beam of his flashlight. It was a big fat worm. It was at least 9 inches long and as big around as a pencil. Wow, said Henry. It was hard to believe, but there it was. Mr. Grumby put it into the jar. Do you use them to catch fish? Asked Henry. Excuse me. That's right, Mr. Grumby pounced again. What kind of fish? Some kinds of trout, salmon, perch, catfish, different kinds of fish. I'm going salmon fishing in the Columbia River in the morning. Henry thought this over. Do you always catch worms at night? Yes, they only come out at night when the ground is wet. I give the lawn a good soaking so they'll come up to the top. Then I turn on the light and grab them quick before they have a chance to pull back into the ground. Mrs. Grumby stepped out on the porch and called to her husband, Hector, if you expect me to have a lunch ready for you to take fishing at 3 o'clock in the morning, you better go to the store for a loaf of bread right now before it closes. All right, in a minute. As his wife went back into the house, Mr. Grumby said to Henry, how would you like to earn some money? Catching worms? I'll say I would. I'll pay you a penny apiece for every night crawler you catch. Golly, said Henry, a penny apiece? How many do you want? As many as you can catch. If I can't use them, some of the other men can. He handed Henry the jar and the flashlight, got into his car, and drove away. A penny apiece. There were 100 pennies in a dollar, so it would take 1,395 worms to pay for the football and 41 worms for the tax. Henry went around the rose bushes and tiptoed across the grass. Because of the doggy be gone, Ribsy stayed on his own side of the rose bushes. Henry turned on the flashlight, and sure enough, there on the grass was the end of a big fat worm. But when Henry bent to pick it up, it was gone. He tiptoed farther across the grass and turned on the light again. This time he moved faster. He grabbed the end of the cold, slippery worm. The other end was already in the ground. Henry pulled, and the worm pulled. The worm stretched. It grew longer and thinner until it snapped out of Henry's hand and disappeared into the ground. Ugh, said Henry. The next time he moved still faster. He pounced on the worm before either end had a chance to get in the ground. He caught it. That's 1 penny, he thought. After that, it was easier. He caught most of the worms on the first pounce. So there he is. Pretty soon he'd caught 62 worms. Then he discovered he was running out of worms. Either he'd caught all of Mr. Grumby's worms, or they had felt him walking around on the ground and retired for the night, and he hadn't earned enough to pay for the football. Just as Henry was wondering where he could find some more worms, Mr. Grumby came back from the store. I caught 62 worms for you, said Henry. 62? That's great. Mr. Grumby reached into his pants pocket and brought out a handful of change. He picked out a 50-cent piece, a dime, and 2 pennies and gave them to Henry. Thank you, said Henry politely. He wished he'd caught more worms. Mr. Grumby started to go into the house and then stopped. Say, Shorty, he said to Henry, who was going back through the rose bushes, I'll tell you what you can do. Sunday morning, I'm going fishing with a bunch of men from my lodge. Quite a few of us are going, and we can use all the worms you can catch. Tomorrow night, you can get someone to help you and catch enough for all of us. Sure, said Henry eagerly. I'll catch hundreds of worms for you. Swell. We can use them, answered Mr. Grumby as he went into the house. Henry sat down on his front steps again. Because he needed so much money, he knew he would have to catch all the worms himself. That meant he would need a lot of wet lawn. His mother would be pleased, even surprised to have him